Jake "Dusty" McCallister was no stranger to a dare. A rugged cowboy with a weathered hat perched low over his brow, he had spent his life chasing adventure across the wide open plains of Texas. Horses, cattle, and dusty trails were his comfort zone, and yet there was an unquenchable thirst inside him for the unknown, a pull toward challenges that would test his courage and wits. One evening, as the amber glow of the bar lights reflected off worn wooden walls, Jake sat with a group of old friends, laughter spilling over like whiskey from their glasses. Tales of rodeos, long rides, and narrow escapes filled the smoky room, each story more daring than the last. Then, in a moment of playful audacity, one of his companions leaned forward, eyes gleaming with mischief. "I dare you," his friend said, voice low and teasing, "to go all the way to Mongolia. Live with the nomads, ride their horses, and see if you can survive a week in the steppes. No cities, no comforts, just you and the wilderness." Jake chuckled, taking a slow sip from his glass, the idea both thrilling and absurd. Mongolia. The name alone conjured images of endless green plains, wild horses, and ancient traditions untouched by modern life. The very thought sent a shiver of excitement down his spine. A week with nomads in a foreign land? That wasn't just a dare, it was the kind of story he would tell for the rest of his life. The stranger at the end of the bar caught Jake's eye, a wizened old man with a knowing look. "Be careful," he said softly. "The steppe is beautiful, yes, but unforgiving. It humbles the bravest men." Jake smiled, tipping his hat. Adventure had always carried risk, and he had never been one to shy away from it. With a grin, he accepted the challenge, unaware that this journey would not just test his skill with a lasso or his endurance on horseback, but would also change the way he saw the world and himself. By the time Jake left the bar that night, the dare had shifted from playful banter to an irresistible calling, a summons to a land where the horizon stretched endlessly, and the spirit of adventure waited at every turn. The day Jake departed, the Texas sun hung low over the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the dusty plains he had always called home. With his hat firmly in place and a well-worn duffel slung over his shoulder, he stepped into a world completely foreign to him, one measured not in acres of ranch land but in thousands of miles of untamed wilderness. Airports, security lines, and crowded terminals replaced the familiar smell of leather saddles and hay, and yet the excitement thrummed through him like the heartbeat of a galloping horse. By the time he landed in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia's capital, Jake's senses were awash in a cascade of new sights and sounds. Streets thrummed with motorbikes and minibuses, vendors called out in a language he could barely understand, and the scent of fried dumplings and horse milk permeated the air. Towering buildings jutted into the sky, yet between them, flashes of traditional Mongolian life peeked through men and women in colorful deal, herding livestock through narrow alleyways, the ancient rhythm of the steppes subtly embedded even in the city. Jake quickly realized that surviving Mongolia would require more than courage. It demanded adaptation, observation, and respect for a culture far older and stranger than any rodeo he had faced. He hired a local guide, Batu, a stocky man with weathered skin and eyes as sharp as a hawk. Batu greeted him with a nod, his voice calm but firm. "The steppe does not forgive mistakes," he said. "It is beautiful, yes, but it can be deadly." The next morning, they set out in a rugged jeep, leaving the city behind. As they drove east, the urban chaos gave way to rolling green plains that stretched farther than the eye could see, punctuated by distant mountains and the occasional lone gur standing against the horizon. The vastness was humbling. Jake felt both a rush of exhilaration and the faint chill of vulnerability. Every mile of the journey deepened his appreciation for Mongolia's wild beauty. Streams sparkled like molten silver, wild horses raced across the plains, and flocks of sheep dotted the landscape like scattered clouds. With Batu's guidance, Jake began to learn the rhythms of the land, where the water ran deepest, which paths offered safe passage, and how to read the signs left by animals and wind. By the time the sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and purple, Jake understood he was no longer merely a visitor. He was a student, about to immerse himself in a world where survival, tradition, and freedom walked hand in hand. Jake's first glimpse of the nomadic lifestyle came as the jeep slowed near a small cluster of jares perched on a gentle slope overlooking the endless steppe. The family that welcomed him was as warm as the sun above, a father with a strong, steady gaze, a mother whose hands moved deftly as she prepared food over a small fire, and two children, shy at first, but curious about the strange cowboy who had dared to venture so far from home. The air smelled of smoke and livestock, sweet and earthy, a stark contrast to the city's metallic tang. Jake followed Batu's lead, stepping carefully into the circular GER. Its interior was simple but functional. A low wooden stove in the center, mats arranged neatly around the edges, and walls decorated with colorful textiles and talismans meant to protect the family from spirits. He felt like he had stepped into another world, one where time moved differently, measured not by clocks but by the sun, the wind, and the needs of the animals. His first lessons began immediately. Mounted on a short, sturdy Mongolian horse, Jake was introduced to a riding style entirely unlike the one he had mastered in Texas. These horses were small but powerful, with hearts that beat as fiercely as the rider's own. Batu instructed him on balance, speed, and control, teaching him how to guide the horse using subtle shifts in weight rather than forceful reins. It was humbling work. Jake had always prided himself on his ability to control a horse, but here, he was reminded that the land and its creatures demanded respect. Next came herding, a task that required more than skill. It demanded patience, intuition, and an understanding of animal behavior. Sheep, goats, and horses roamed the plains freely, and Jake learned to anticipate their movements, to read the language of their eyes and ears. His lasso, a familiar tool from home, found new purpose in this foreign land, looping around stubborn animals with the help of Batu's guidance. By the end of the first week, Jake's arms ached, and his muscles burned, but he felt a deep satisfaction in his growing competence. Meals were another revelation. Fermented mare's milk, or arag, was an acquired taste, but he quickly grew to appreciate the warm, hearty soups and flatbreads the family prepared. Food was simple but nourishing, eaten slowly while sitting cross-legged on mats, stories shared with laughter and gestures when words failed. Jake realized that sustenance here was more than nutrition. It was connection, tradition, and survival rolled into one. Cultural immersion went beyond the practical. The family took Jake to a local festival celebrating the nomadic heritage of the region. He watched wrestlers grapple with raw strength, archers draw their bows with uncanny precision, and riders dash across the plains in a blur of color and motion. Music filled the air, deep, resonant throats singing that seemed to echo from the land itself, telling stories of ancient heroes and the bond between humans and nature. Though he struggled to understand the language, Jake felt the emotions pride, joy, and reverence resonating in every note. Not everything came easily. Harsh weather tested his endurance. Blistering sun, sudden hailstorms, and icy nights forced him to adapt quickly. Sleeping on the bare ground, surrounded by unfamiliar sounds, the bray of horses, the bleat of goats, the whistle of wind across the plains was a lesson in humility. Yet, each challenge strengthened his connection to the land and to the people who had mastered it. As days passed, Jake found himself transformed in subtle ways. He learned patience, not as a mere virtue, but as a necessity. He discovered that communication went beyond words, and that respect for nature was intertwined with respect for people. Sitting by the fire at night, journal in hand, he wrote of sunsets that set the sky ablaze, of herds moving like living rivers across green plains, and of laughter that needed no translation. By the end of his stay, Jake had become more than a visitor. He could ride the horses with confidence, herd the animals with skill, and participate in the daily rituals of nomadic life. The family, once strangers, had become teachers and friends, their way of life opening a door to understanding that went far beyond the cowboy bravado he had carried into Mongolia. In the quiet moments, he realized that adventure was not simply about danger or spectacle. It was about learning, connection, and living fully in a world far larger than himself. The day began like any other, with the pale morning sun stretching its fingers across the endless steppe. Jake saddled his horse, feeling the familiar weight of the reins, and decided to venture a little farther than usual. Batu had warned him about wandering alone, but the cowboy in him, a restless blend of curiosity and bravado, urged him onward. He imagined testing his skills, pushing his limits, and perhaps discovering hidden corners of the vast Mongolian plains. At first, everything seemed perfect. The wind brushed against his face, carrying the scent of grass, wildflowers, and distant smoke from nomadic fires. Herds of sheep grazed lazily, and wild horses galloped in the distance, manes flowing like ribbons in the breeze. Jake felt an intoxicating sense of freedom, the kind only the open wilderness could provide. But as the hours passed, the landscape, so familiar in its patterns, began to blur into one endless green horizon. Trails disappeared, and landmarks vanished. A knot of unease twisted in his stomach. He realized he was utterly, completely lost. Panic tried to creep in, but Jake forced himself to stay calm. He dismounted and scanned the horizon, trying to recall Batu's instructions on reading the land, the direction of the wind, the slope of the hills, the tracks of animals. He attempted to retrace his path, but the steps seemed to shift, as if mocking his inexperience. By midday, clouds gathered, heavy and low, promising a sudden storm, a common, yet dangerous, occurrence in this unpredictable land. The rain began as a whisper, then quickly turned into a relentless downpour. The wind cut through his soaked clothing, chilling him to the bone. Seeking shelter, Jake found a small natural dip in the ground, where he crouched behind rocks and bundles of dry grass. He built a makeshift fire with trembling fingers, struggling against wind and wet tinder, and watched the storm rage across the plains. For the first time, he felt the vulnerability of a man alone, stripped of the comfort and control he had always relied on. Hours stretched into what felt like an eternity. He relied on the skills Batu had taught him, identifying edible plants, conserving water, and staying as dry as possible. Hunger gnawed at him, but the steppe demanded patience. That night, as the storm eased, Jake gazed at the sky. Stars appeared one by one, crystal clear in the dark expanse above, and the enormity of the world pressed in on him. He realized how small he was, how dependent he had become on both nature and the people who understood it. In that moment, the thrill of adventure mingled with humility. Just as dawn broke, painting the horizon in shades of pink and gold, Batu and a small group of nomads appeared on horseback. Relief surged through Jake, mingled with gratitude. The reunion was filled with laughter, chiding, and gentle scolding, but also a quiet acknowledgement. The cowboy had learned a lesson the hard way. For Jake, the experience was transformative. He had ventured into the unknown with bravado, but the steppe had demanded respect, patience, and humility. It had tested his courage, yes, but also awakened a profound appreciation for the land, its people, and the delicate balance between freedom and survival. By the time he returned to the nomadic family, soaked and exhausted but alive, Jake understood that adventure was not just about daring feats, it was about connection, resilience, and learning to move through the world with awareness and respect. The journey back to Ulaanbaatar was quieter than Jake had anticipated. The steppe stretched endlessly on either side, but now it no longer felt intimidating. It felt alive, familiar in a way he hadn't expected. Every hill, every stream, every lone gur seemed to carry a story, a rhythm he had come to understand. He rode beside Batu in companionable silence, reflecting on the lessons the land had taught him. Back in the city, the bustling streets of Ulaanbaatar felt almost surreal after the quiet expanse of the steppe. Motorbikes, cars, and shouting vendors surrounded him, yet Jake noticed things he hadn't before: the resilience in people's faces, the artistry of small details, the way modern life coexisted with centuries of tradition. The contrast only deepened his appreciation for the nomads he had lived with, and the simplicity, strength, and wisdom embedded in their daily lives. When Jake finally returned home to Texas, he was a changed man. Friends crowded around him at the bar, eager to hear the stories behind his bold adventure. As he recounted moments of galloping across the plains, sharing meals with a nomadic family, and surviving a storm that had left him drenched and humbled, their eyes widened with disbelief. He showed photographs of horse herds running like rivers of freedom, the jares standing proud against the horizon, and the fierce, joyful expressions of the people who had welcomed him so openly. But beyond the stories and images, Jake carried something more profound, a transformation within himself. He had ventured to Mongolia seeking a thrill, a story for bragging rights, but he returned with humility, patience, and a deeper understanding of connection both to the land and to people whose lives were far different from his own. He realized that adventure was not merely about daring feats, but about learning, listening, and being present. Even in the familiar surroundings of Texas, the dusty trails, the open plains, the clang of spurs and hooves, Jake noticed subtle changes in himself. He rode his horse differently now, with the quiet balance he had learned from the Mongolian mounts. He watched the sky and the wind with a newfound respect, understanding that freedom came not just from movement, but from harmony with the world around him. As he leaned against the fence, hat pulled low and eyes fixed on the horizon, Jake smiled. The dare that had seemed like a reckless challenge had become an unforgettable journey, one that had left him and everyone who heard his story truly stunned. Back in the quiet of his Texas ranch, Jake often found his thoughts drifting to the vast Mongolian steppe. The memory of endless green plains, the thundering gallop of wild horses, and the warmth of the nomadic family's fire lingered in his mind like a song he could never forget. What had begun as a simple dare, a reckless challenge among friends, had transformed into something far greater, a journey of self-discovery, humility, and connection. He realized that adventure was never truly about danger or the thrill of the unknown alone. It was about stepping beyond comfort, embracing uncertainty, and opening oneself fully to the lessons of the world. In Mongolia, he had learned to ride in ways that challenged his instincts, heard animals with patience, and read the subtle language of the land. He had faced storms that tested his endurance, and in those moments of struggle, he had discovered resilience he never knew he possessed. More importantly, he had glimpsed a way of life that honored nature, tradition, and community. The nomad's wisdom was quiet but profound. Survival was not about dominance over the land, but about harmony with it. Strength was not only physical, but also patience, understanding, and respect. These lessons stayed with him, reshaping not only how he approached the world, but how he viewed himself. Even as he returned to familiar trails and dusty sunsets, Jake carried Mongolia within him. He rode his horse differently now, attuned to the rhythms of the land, and looked at his surroundings with renewed awe. The cowboy who had left on a dare had returned not just with stories, but with a deeper sense of purpose and a heart humbled by experience. When friends asked about his journey, he no longer spoke merely of galloping across plains or surviving storms. Instead, he shared the true gift of the adventure, the understanding that the world is vast, mysterious, and filled with lessons for those willing to listen. The dare had been a spark, but the journey had become a transformation. Jake smiled quietly, tipping his hat to the horizon. The step had changed him forever, and in that silent acknowledgement, he knew one thing with certainty. Real adventure leaves you stunned not with danger, but with life itself.